How's it going, everybody? Greg here, Gregarious Media, here with another episode of Discog Devil, where I go over the worst and best of an artist's discography. This week, I'm going to be going over one of my favorite bands of the 2010s, because they started in 2010, and they're also one of the most interesting and influential artists of this decade, Death Grips. Death Grips are a trio based out of Sacramento, California, featuring MC Ride, Zach Hill, and Andy Morin. They are known for this very unique fusion of hardcore hip-hop, hardcore punk, industrial, electronic music, and even a little bit of spoken word in the mix. And that's just their core sound that they initially started with. They have since expanded their sound, and no album copies itself twice. There's not really a lot of history that I can find on Death Grips, because they rarely ever do interviews, and a lot of their promotion, or especially in their earlier days, was sort of shrouded in mystery, usually giving out very cryptic hints and posts over their Instagrams and Twitter and Facebook and even YouTube. They effectively have used social media with their persona so brilliantly. Now, with later albums, sort of since the release of Jenny Death / The Powers That Be, they have sort of gone a little bit more arguably traditional in their marketing. When it came to Bottomless Pit and Year of the Snitch, it was much more of like a pre-order, not just a surprise, hey, here's an album sort of thing that they would do earlier with albums such as No Love Deep Web, and I believe Government Plates even had a little bit more of a surprise factor. So I got into Death Grips around high school, and I believe I saw a review of Ex-Military from Mr. Fantano, Internet's busiest music nerd, best teeth in the game. Kind of one of the main inspirations as to why I'm doing these videos, and I'm not attempting to kiss ass, but hey Fantano, if you're watching, thanks man. And the way that he was describing their sound was very odd to me. I didn't really know any major experimental hip-hop at that time, and admittedly, it's still a genre that, while I've sort of dabbled in, I'm not a major expert of. So Death Grips was really kind of the one band that I've always gravitated toward in terms of this genre. When I first heard Ex-Military, of course, I heard Guillotine, which was very memeable, this incredibly strange lo-fi video. Guillotine! So obviously an incredibly strange song that I was just intrigued to listen to even more of their discography. And little did I know that it was their debut. So since then, I have listened to just about every single album outside of maybe a couple instrumental releases. Death Grips are one of my favorite bands, just period, of any time period. Just because of this incredibly raw presentation, this incredibly weird mythos around them, this sort of the way how they're shrouded in mystery, and how every album always has this unique flavor to it that you can never really compare one to the other, at least not on a very sonic level. Now, the only albums I'm going to be going over are ones where Ride is featured actually prominently on the albums, so I'm not going to be going over any of the instrumental stuff. I'm not going to be going over their EPs. Fashion Week is off the list because essentially that was just a cock tease meme. The track list is Jenny Death When, which was a meme. They responded to a meme with an instrumental album of the title track in memes. Motherfucker. Here's the episode of Discog Devil, worst to best, Death Grips. Let's go. At the bottom of this list, at number 7, I have to go with Government Plates. This tends to be pretty low on a lot of fans' lists, and I can see why. It's at the bottom of my list too. Primarily because this is one that has multiple flaws to it. For starters, MC Ride is not on here a lot of the time. He's on at least over half the album, but a good amount of his vocals end up just being sampled into sort of plain instrumental kind of things that overall aren't the most interesting. A lot of songs on here don't really sound as inspired as previous and even future albums comparing to this. It starts off like a pretty aggressive Death Grips intro with the extremely long album title that, honestly, did Fall Out Boy write the fucking title to this? Like, what the fuck? This intro definitely starts off the album really good. Anybody, following up the intro, is a pretty decent track. Birds, I think, was the first teaser for this album, and it was definitely a weird-ass track, having these extremely mellow portions, and then all of a sudden there's these very spastic electronic sort of bursts of energy. And that, I think, got me really intrigued because it was even more abstract than what was presented on No Love Deep Web. But really, every song outside of the intro and Birds don't really hold up, I think, in terms of, what is a good or bad Death Grips song. They're just not really that memorable. The songs are just these really uninteresting loops, or they sound like throwaway kind of B-side tracks to previous albums, just remixed in a way that aren't quite as identifiable. There's not a lot that I can say about Government Plates that is good, because it's just not memorable, and that tends to be sort of a theme with the bottom of the lists for even previous episodes, and this one included. Government Plates has good moments. It's just really only for 2, maybe 3 songs. The intro and Birds are pretty high marks on this album, and outside of that, there really isn't much to talk about. The palette is just not as ambitious or as interesting. Next on this list is No Love Deep Web, and I am expecting a lot of shit for putting it this low. But please attempt to hear me out. This album was leaked, because this album was the planned follow-up to The Money Store, and Death Grips wanted to release this album sooner than the label wanted to, so they leaked it with an album art of Zach Hill's dick. And of course, because they leaked this album themselves, they were kicked off Epic Records. So Money Store was the only major label release that they had. Now, could they have handled it better? Yeah, probably. Was this album, I think, a good follow-up to The Money Store? Well, I have it this low on the list. You can take a guess for yourself. At the time, Zach Hill claimed that this was the heaviest album that they had recorded, and considering that there were only 2 other albums to base this off of, I was pretty intrigued. And I think some songs do convey this pretty good. No Love, World of Dogs were pretty heavy, and I did enjoy those tracks quite a bit. You also had some really, really catchy tracks off here, such as Lil Boy and Whammy, that were definitely much more electronically straightforward, and yet at the same time being very abrasive and weird. Outside of these tracks, this, compared to Government Plates, is much better. But again, like Government Plates, and this might just be, and I think this is just for personal taste, because I can't really give a good reason why, but this album just never really clicked with me as other Death Grips albums I'm going to be going over. And to be honest, I don't know why. I think the songwriting on here is fine, but nothing that I think, when comparing 2 other albums, truly stands out in comparison. Artificial Death in the West, I think, is a decent cut. It's pretty melodic, pretty spacious, but if I had to come up with another reason for another track to be mentioned, I know for some fans this is really high up there. I know some of my friends who actually have this at the top of their list. So I do apologize to other fans, because maybe I'm not explaining myself as good. Maybe I'm not explaining really why this album doesn't click, but it just, I don't know, it just doesn't. Next on this list, we have the debut ex-military mixtape album thing. With the viral hit of Guillotine, this project definitely sent Death Grips into a much wider audience. I would not say it got mainstream attention, more so in the sense that if it got any mainstream attention, it was more like, look at this weird shit. The reason I haven't talked lyrics up until this point is because Death Grips tend to have a pretty general theme with a lot of their lyrics. Tends to be about abandoning humanity, sort of mental states, with mostly paranoia being involved, drugs, violence, depression, suicide, and just a lot of lyricism around these topics and sort of little subtopics in between. And it's just the way that sort of Ride presents himself and the way that his lyrics are portrayed. It tends to be very cryptic. I'll admit some songs I don't quite understand still to this day, and this is just talking in general, not specifically ex-military. But as to why I haven't tackled lyrics at this up until this point is because most of each album tends to revolve around these general themes. Now, back to ex-military, this is notably different because this actually features a lot more samples in their sounds and not really as much of an industrial hip-hop punk kind of band that would sort of present itself in the Money Store. Now, while that definitely had its share of samples, it was much less direct as opposed to ex-military, which definitely featured a healthy amount of samples. And it actually featured a lot of different psychedelic grooves and psychedelic samples. You have Spread Eagle Across the Block and I Want It, I Need It having much more of a rock-oriented feel. Spread Eagle having this very roaring guitar sample, and I Want It, I Need It actually sounded like something that you could probably have put on even Bottomless Pit if you remixed it. I would do a much better impression if I did not have neighbors. You also have a song like Through the Walls, which opens up with these blaring air horns that you would hear when, you got memed to death. But this very odd, kind of cool, deep synth sort of line, and these very just jumpy kind of drums. God, I am describing this poorly. A lot of the songs off here tend to have these very sporadic but very clear synth lines and very primal drums. Ride sounding like between a schizophrenic homeless guy screaming in your face and the fucking devil. It's truly a sound to behold, and I feel like if I attempt to describe this album any further, I'm going to do this a lot of injustice. The production on this album is very lo-fi, very raw, so if you're looking for something that's a bit more pleasant to the ear, I would not start with this project. I would definitely start with this project only because it's incredible to see sort of where Death Grips started, already sounding incredibly weird and unlike anything else as in hip-hop or punk rap, industrial, experimental rap that has happened up until this point, and sort of how they've evolved from this mixtape into their plethora of albums that they have now. And mind you, they started in 2010, and they already have, 6 other albums that came off of this mixtape. And I'm not counting the instrumental albums and EPs that have followed. I mean, Death Grips have always been a very busy band, and just sort of seeing where they've progressed from this mixtape is truly extraordinary. And honestly, this mixtape itself still holds up really well. Next on this list at number 4, we have The Powers That Be. This is a double album that released one part of the album pretty much a year and a half before the second half. The first half was released for free on SoundCloud and their website, and this definitely featured much more of an unorthodox sound, sort of continuing the abstractness that I think Government Plates was going for but didn't really execute as well. And this particular half completely samples Bjork vocals that she actually recorded specifically for this project. So that alone is kind of an impressive footnote. The way in which these have been incorporated are just some of the most abrasive and uncompromising sounds that Death Grips has ever recorded. And it's still incredibly catchy at points. You have songs like Black Quarterback and Have a Sad Come BB having incredibly catchy hooks and infectious rhythms that will not come out of your head. And you have some of the really abrasive openings like Up My Sleeve and Billy Not Really that are just mind-melting. It's just a very odd first half, especially when you compare it to the second half, Jenny Death. Essentially goes full-on rock, having actual distorted guitars and even an organ on several tracks. Open up with I Break Mirrors with My Face in the United States, and it's just a fucking punk banger right out the get-go. You have Why a Bitch Gotta Lie, The Powers That Be, Beyond Alive, which sound like insane rock versions of what would already be weird Death Grip songs. But the way that they translate it with guitar and organ and live drums is just done so brilliantly. The only song on here that sounds a little out of place, or a couple songs that sound just slightly out of place, would be Inanimate Sensation and Death Grips 2.0, sounding much more electronic based, sort of much more than the typical Death Grips vein, but still having that experimental flair that you could say would even fit on the first disc, but it doesn't feature any Bjork samples. Inanimate Sensation is actually the single off Jenny Death, so it was very misleading when you compare that to the rest of Jenny Death, which has much more of a rock-oriented sort of sound, especially on a track like On GP, which is the probably most straightforward rock song that they had recorded up until this point. I honestly love this album. It's very contrasting when you compare Nodum compared to Jenny Death, but both albums I feel have their specific place and are both very, very great projects. And the fact that this was combined as a double album almost makes sense. Going into I Break Mirrors with My Face in the United States, coming right off of the last track off Nodum, it is a weird transition, and yet the weird abrasive energy that the first half of this project sort of ends off does continue onto Jenny Death. It's just translated in a much more rock context with the guitars and live instrumentation. This is a sound that they would continue with throughout the follow-up albums, yet they would still approach it in such a different way that I was not expecting this to sort of be the transition sound that they would go toward. But then again, maybe that's why they ended on a song like Death Grips 2.0, as showing that this is sort of the second wave, the second chapter in sort of where Death Grips would be going. Or that this would sort of be the end of the first chapter, and that the next wave of Death Grips albums would be different from this. It's a weird thing to think about, but long story short, this album is really good. I think if the albums were separate, Jenny Death would probably be alone higher on my list than where it is, and that's no offense to Nottum, because I do enjoy it. I just enjoy Jenny Death more because it has much more of the raw punk sound that sort of hits me harder. At number 3 for the bronze, we have the latest release, Year of the Snitch. Year of the Snitch shows Death Grips experimenting with their core sound once again. And this does sort of have much more of a rock-oriented sound. Like, the hip-hop element is still there, but it's not really as focused on. There's much more of a punk rock vibe to this album. In fact, the opening track to this album sounds like a very tripped out rave. Death Grips is online. Then it leads into Flies, one of the singles off this album, that just sounds very abrasive, off-kilter, very sporadic sonically, and very, very cryptic. Ride is going over these lyrics in the chorus about flies vomiting him and vomit green eyes. I'm probably misquoting that. This is just a very weird, abrasive track that you almost would expect from Death Grips, but it has much more of a psychedelic texture that you can't really compare it to like a Nottum or even No Love Deep Web. And then it transitions into Black Paint, which is one of the most upfront punk rock songs that they have ever recorded, while still having these turntables from DJ Swamp and these very psychedelic textures like littered throughout the track. It's honestly one of the most simplified songs that Death Grips I think have ever recorded, and yet it works so perfectly. It's easily one of my favorite Death Grips songs, period. And before I continue on the sort of different sort of sounds that Death Grips explores on this project, this is actually a very collaborative project. You have features from Andrew Adamson, known for Shrek and Chronicles of Narnia. You have Justin Chancellor from Tool. You have Justice Yildhem, who's an Australian noise musician, and DJ Swamp, who is focusing on the turntable end of this album when, he appears. Another thing with this album is that the production sort of follows the more cleaner, kind of more less lo-fi, a little bit crisper sound that Bottomless Pit had. I think it fits well with this sort of more experimental and psychedelic approach to the songwriting. You have a little bit of jazz even on songs like Linda's in Custody, and definitely more so on the song The Fear. You have more of the industrial punk energy on songs like Ha 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 and Shit Show, but even those are approached with more of a weird psychedelic element that, again, it's just little textures and little things that you can recognize that these are Death Grips songs, but the way that it's approached is still different from even the previous album, Bottomless Pit. This album sort of has the looseness that Ex-Military had, catchiness in songwriting like The Money Store, the experimentation of the powers that be, and yet really I can't compare this sonically to any of those albums. I can find elements from every Death Grips album sort of on here, and yet this album truly stands out on its own merits. That executes all the sort of elements that were picked from these other albums and threw in even newer elements like the psychedelic and jazz elements. And just really, this album is just a surprise that I was not expecting from a Death Grips album. For the silver, we have the only major label album that they've ever released, The Money Store, where Ex-Military sort of put Death Grips on the map as sort of the next pioneers in this experimental hip-hop field. Money Store solidified their position, going much more in a sort of electronic punk and even more of a band sound, where Ex-Military sort of used samples as more as like little snippets or backdrops or this like moments in the song. They really incorporate samples into their synth lines here, and the way in which they've just upped their sound, and it's not just the fact that they have a bigger budget because they're on Epic Records. It's still pretty lo-fi considering, but from the opening rhythms of Get Got to the insane, like, intense, like, murder rave sound of Hacker, there's not a single dull moment on this album. There's not a single song on here that I could say is bad or just bland. Like, every song on here has its position. The Fever is probably one of my favorite tracks off here. It has incredibly intense verses and this very catchy and surprisingly incredibly melodic synth line with just Ride making this really catchy, "I got the fever." I'm coming off like as if Bernie Sanders suddenly listens to Death Grips, and that would be insane if he did. I sincerely doubt it, but it'd be great if he did. You have Hustle Bones, which has this incredibly infectious and undeniable groove, and these vocal samples used as sort of the melody over the chorus line is insane. You also have I've Seen Footage, which is probably the most straightforward song off this project, having much more of like a dance rock kind of vibe. But even then, I would not have imagined this song ever fucking making radio. It's just really weird. And you have Bitch Please, which is kind of a hilarious song. Not really on subject matter, but just the way that Ride sort of says, "Bitch please, you must be smoking rock real shit." Why, every time I listen to the song, I can't help but just get a dumb fucking smile on my face. And of course, Hacker is a fucking banger. Every song off here is a banger. And I feel like I'm not going to have as much to say on here because, you know, this is Fantano's first 10 rating. And pretty much what he said on here, I would just be regurgitating. I feel like I've partially regurgitated already. So, yeah, if for some reason you haven't heard Death Grips yet, and you've made it this far into the list, and have still not checked out Death Grips, listen to this album. If you're not going to start with Ex-Military, start with this. And at number 1 for the gold, we have Bottomless Pit. Now, I know some people might say that this album is just a victory lap album. This essentially takes the elements that they've explored since Money Store up to Jenny Death, Powers That Be, and just sort of fuses them into this one project, condenses them into their essentials. And that's kind of the reason why this is my favorite. On top of the fact that the production is a bit crisper, it's a bit cleaner, so it's a bit more ear-pleasing. It's not just lo-fi noise. I think the songwriting on here, they do take it back to sort of a Money Store-esque style where they boil it down to the essentials, just very catchy, abrasive. I wouldn't go so far to say as their pop, but definitely the catchiest and as close to pop as they would border, while still being extremely experimental and abrasive. And if you think for a second that, you know, this album is just going to be, you know, a watered down version of Death Grips because it's just taking every element from every album that they've done up until this point, and I'm saying that it's one of the catchiest things that they've ever done, it opens up with fucking blast beats for the entire goddamn song. Giving Bad People Good Ideas is just Zach Hill going fucking ballistic on drums, and Ride screaming his ass off, and then slowly it gets into this chorus of these layered female vocals of giving bad people good ideas, I keep giving bad people good ideas, I keep giving bad people good ideas, I keep giving bad people good ideas. And then following that up into Hothead, which still has this incredibly spastic, still slightly blast beat, if not like free jazz style insanity, where it sounds like Andy is just glitching the shit out of whatever synth thing he has set in, and Zach is just throwing his fucking sticks around the kit, and then it goes into this incredibly sick groove. You have Spikes, which is one of the catchiest songs that they have ever written, period. Do not even attempt to fight me on this one. You have Bubbles Buried in This Jungle, Ring a Bell. The closing track off here is just a straight punk banger. It's, again, one of those songs where it's super simple, to the point, and it works. And then lyrically, you actually have a bit of self-awareness on this album, with tracks like Eh and Trash, where Eh is Ride basically saying, who the fuck do you think I am, and why do you think I care about what you have to think about me? And then Trash is sort of this acknowledgement that Death Grips sort of upload what people would consider trash, or this very scum-like thing. And he is sort of like, he doesn't give a shit. Again, you can argue that this album is purely a victory lap, and that it doesn't hold up to others on some form of like impact in terms of like the music scene, or even in Death Grips' discography. I could understand that. For me personally, this translates, I think, what was so great about The Money Store and all their other albums, takes it in this raw punk energy form that translates much better with me, and just comes up with 13 tracks of just non-stop greatness. Bottomless Pit is at number 1 for me, because I don't give a shit if this is a victory lap album. This is the best victory lap album I have heard, and this is probably as close to a sequel to Money Store directly as we're probably gonna get. But I mean, Death Grips have always experimented in so many different genres, and the fact that they could even go into an album like Year of the Snitch after doing something like this is still insane, and I'm really intrigued to see where Death Grips are gonna go. And who knows, maybe that might even be better than Bottomless Pit, but we'll have to see. So my battery's dying, so I'm going to attempt to do this quick. That'll be the end of Discog Devil. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. What are your favorite Death Grips albums from worst to best? Leave comments, yibbity-doo-blah-blah-blah. Leave a comment down below telling me what your favorite Death Grips albums are, or worst to best. And also check out my social media links down in the description below. Also check out the playlist of previous Discog Devil episodes of this particular season. Stay tuned for next week, where I'm going to be going over another artist. Worst to best, Discog Devil, Gregarious Media. Yeah, thank you. Goodbye. Woo. See you next time. Yeah!